Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming so much. My name is Pippa Evans. Just so you know, I'm a performer and have a particular interest in improvisation and musical comedy. I'm also a facilitator of personal development workshops and spaces, so I'm really delighted to be here today to speak with Robin about his book because I'm really interested in that relationship between comedy and being a human. So before we begin, can I just check that you've all actually turned off your mobile phones or turned them to silent? We are filming today's event and live streaming over the web, so hello everyone out there. And a reminder that the hashtag is hashtag RSA human for all of you modern young people. And if you'd like to get involved, you can use that on Twitter, online. You can tweet during this event. I don't know, how do you feel about that, Robin? Do you like people tweeting whilst listening to you?
I'll take any love I can get.
That's very good. The classic comedian response. So, of course, Robin. Here is Robin. Robin is an award-winning comedian and broadcaster and co-presenter of The Infinite Monkey Cage on BBC Radio 4. He has won the Time Out Outstanding Achievement in Comedy, among many other awards and nominations, and has taken his stand-up all over the world. Robin joins us today to explore some of the absurd, terrifying and hilarious experiences that make us human. Bringing together his love of comedy and science, he lends his inimitable perspective and wit to the fundamental life-defining issues that affect us all in his new book, I'm a Joke, and So Are You. So we're going to start this event with Robin sharing some of the thinking in his book. Then I'm going to join him back on stage, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation. And then we're going to open up the floor for any questions you might have for Robin about what he's talking about. So, without further ado, please welcome the brilliant Robin Ince.
Thanks, Pippa. Thank you. I've never talked about this book for less than an hour and a half, so I'm going to try in 20 minutes to explain what it's all, what I tried to make sure it was about. The first thing I can tell you about it is it's a book that's led to me going into therapy, and I don't know if that's a good advert or a bad advert. I interviewed 5 therapists for this book, and at the end of every interview they went, I presume you're in therapy, Robin? And I said no, and they went, oh. And... So that's been, and it's not a book just about, it's been a very interesting thing. I'm seeing a North London Freudian, and because I'm very old-fashioned, and I would highly recommend, if any of you are thinking of therapy, go with a Freudian, because some days I walk in and I think, I've got nothing, but my God, how quickly they find something. It's... Even when I sent an email saying that because I'm on tour a lot, there were a couple of Tuesdays that I couldn't do, and then I went in the next day, and if anyone has had kind of Freudian therapy, you know there's a frame, so you don't do any small talk, you kind of go, hello, hello, and you go straight to the couch. And I got on the couch, and I lay there, and she went, oh, now you sent me an email yesterday, didn't you? And I sat up, and I went, oh, yes, it's just about a couple of timetabling things, and she went, oh, this is very interesting. Why are you sitting up for this bit? I went, oh, I thought we were pragmatically talking about timetabling, but we're not, are we? This is part of it. She went, yes. I went, okay. And it's just, I find it very interesting. So I suppose that at 49 years old, one of the things that I realised as I wrote this book was to use the line of the philosopher Kierkegaard about the fact that life is lived forwards and understood backwards. And the fact that the further away we get from events, very often they become clearer into focus. And I mean, I'll give you the starting point of this book. The starting point was, I think it was the 15th of August, 2014. It might have been the 16th. And it was, I was at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And when I'm at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, I normally do between about 7 and 8 gigs a day. And people will go, why do you do so many gigs? And I go, well, what else are you going to do? I mean, you know this, Pippa. If you don't do loads of gigs, you just sit in cafes going, oh, The Guardian haven't been in yet. Oh, I've got 3 stars from the list. Have you had anyone from telly? So I think rather than sitting there, whining, doing 1 show a day, do 9 shows a day. Go out there, do lots of different things. So I find it a fascinating experiment every August. And on this particular day, the final show that I was doing was one called Cheaper Than Therapy, which was different comics every night, and they were generally... The idea was it was to make money for the charity Mind, and each night 3 or 4 comics would go on, and they would do a routine that really vented their spleen, or they would actually maybe do a routine that actually was about therapy itself, but how comedy might be used as therapy, but it was generally a stand-up show. And on the night I was doing it with a guy called Eddie Pepitone, who is a brilliant American comedian who is very much an id on legs. And He'd been doing it for years, I'd been doing it for years, and I said to the promoter Christian, I said, why don't we, as well as doing the stand-up bits, why don't we have a conversation afterwards so that we can broaden out? We don't just have to nail everything to jokes. I said, because between Eddie and me, I think we've been doing stand-up about something like 54 years. And Christian went, okay. So we all did our routines, and then there was an interval, and it was a place called Greyfriars Kirkhouse. Everyone went off to have a drink, and it was the normal kind of energetic, boozy hubbub of midnight at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And I didn't have a phone. Everyone else, when they walk out, of course, they immediately turn on their phone. What's happened in the hour? And there was this moment where across the room, I would say it was like a kind of domino effect of silence until it was quite a kind of palpable silence. And I didn't know what was going on. But I knew something had happened, and I went over to someone that I knew from other gigs. I said, Susie, what's going on? Why is everyone so quiet? And she went, don't you know? I said, no. She went, it's Robin Williams. Robin Williams has died. He's killed himself. And it was a genuinely shocking moment. I think it takes a lot to kind of knock out the cheap facetiousness of a bunch of half-drunk comics, but that did it. Everyone was very quiet, and there was a level of confusion about what had happened. And I've always, I myself loved Robin Williams. When I was a kid, I loved Mork and Mindy. When I got a little bit older and I first saw a little bit of his stand-up, I was like, wow, you can do this. This is amazing. And before there was kind of YouTube or you could access things from a cloud, I would go from record shop to record shop, kind of go, oh, I'm trying to find this record. There's 8 minutes of stand-up by Robin Williams on it. And then the older I became, there were the movies he was in, and I think some of them, he had a brilliant way of expressing humanity, whether it's things like Dead Poets Society, or where he plays a version of Oliver Sacks in Awakenings, or one of my favourite films of all time, The Fisher King, by Terry Gilliam. So, there was that level of just shock, because it was someone who was an icon, and only 2 months before Rick Mayall had died, who again was someone that I absolutely adored, and was one of the reasons that I think I propelled myself into comedy. And I was also interested in Robin Williams because I knew there was a compassion about him as well. So the next day I opened the newspapers, and all of the newspapers go with the same, tears of a clown, another tragic funny man, and it turns it into a singular story, and it turned it into a banality. It turned something which may have been done for many different reasons into, oh, well, that's just the narrative arc of comedians, isn't it? And, there may be many different reasons that Robin Williams decided to kill himself, amongst other things. Some of you might know he was suffering from a particularly insidious form of dementia called Lewy bodies dementia. There's lots of different reasons. And as I left, I started to think more and more about the fact that what I find interesting, or one of the many things, so I've always loved comedy from the age of 3 or 4 years. I just love it. And I thought, with all of these myths about comedians, all of those, BBC 4 and the channels, they all love that once-a-year documentary which will be about Frankie Howard or Tommy Cooper or Peter Sellers or Kenneth Williams, where they go, Kenneth Williams made the whole of Britain laugh, but he himself was as miserable as sin, right? And it's this nice, easy kind of... it's interesting. There's a friend of mine, Peter, who knew Kenneth Williams in the last few years of his life, and he loves reading those stories and watching the documentaries, and then I ring him up and find out what was wrong. One of his favourites is they go, Kenneth Williams, they always go, Kenneth Williams wouldn't allow anyone to use his toilet. And Peter said, that's rubbish. I used his toilet on loads of occasions. The only people he didn't allow to use his toilet were people who were beginning to bore him. So if they were in his flat and they went, oh, Kenneth, can I just go to your loo? He'd go, oh, no, you can't get in my toilet. No, you'll have to go outside. And then once they went outside, he'd lock the door, and when they came back, he'd pretend to be asleep. So this is what I find. First of all, I find the fact that all human beings are a multitude fascinating and beautiful. And I also then thought how interesting it is that because of this, the legends of comedians, because the myths are so often retold, how much can we learn from the fact that what is true of comedians is probably actually true of an enormous number of human beings. We are only represented, so we are sometimes the megaphone of the taboos that other people don't want to say. But we go up on stage for 2 hours and go, look at me, here's a weird thing. I knew that I started to get it right. About 10 years ago, I was doing a gig in Nottingham, and afterwards a man came up to me and went, I'm quite annoyed with you. I said, oh, sorry, what have I done? He went, well, I've just sat in with your audience, right? And I've spent my whole life believing that I am quite weird. But sitting with your audience and watching your show, I've realised we're all bloody weird, which means I'm quite normal, which is disappointing. And that that to me is, that's, I mean, I love those moments of connection that can occur, where you can, I used to, I talk about it a bit in the book, about impulsive thoughts, for instance. I did a whole show which was about those thoughts that you have, where maybe, the example I would often give was, you're holding a baby just by a balcony, and suddenly out of nowhere you go, oh my goodness, I just imagined throwing the baby over the balcony. I must be somebody who wants to throw babies over balconies. I shouldn't have a baby in my hands. Liz, do you want to take the baby back? Yes, just my arms are very tired. I didn't imagine just throwing her over the balcony. You want her back, okay, right? So, and I would talk to, I would often say to an audience who's had those kind of thoughts, and very often the hands were quite slow in going up. And it was, my favourite one is still, I haven't got time to tell that story. Anyway, so I've looked at the clock. But I would talk about those things. Sometimes you have those thoughts when you're standing on a train station platform, when you're in a car and you imagine grabbing the steering wheel, all of those things. And I would go off on lots of different tangents, but I would then, at the end, explain that when you have those thoughts, it's not because you have an urge, it's quite the opposite. At moments of jeopardy, like holding a baby near a balcony, your brain plays a public information film. It basically goes, you're holding a baby, so remember, when holding a baby, don't throw it over a balcony. But it delivers it in a slightly cack-handed way, so you go, is that a desire? And I would get people coming up to me afterwards, and there was a lovely one with a lad who was probably only in his late teens. He said, I'm so relieved to find that out. He said, my sister had a baby 4 months ago, and I had this little thought one day, and I've been too scared to hold her baby. So this idea that, what you can do, that's what I hope the book is about. It's offering this framework of initially, like inner voices. Inner voices are, for a lot of people, there's a lot of voices in their head. And I've got about 4 voices in my head most times when I'm performing. And there's one voice which is this one. This is what's coming out. There's another one that's typing, and I've come up with an idea. There's a third one that goes, not now. It's a lunchtime gig at the RSA. It's not suitable. And then there's another voice that's going, someone coughed over there. Are they getting bored? Someone's coughed over there. Now someone's coughed over there. I'm getting, all of these different things are going on. And I talked to Charles Fernyhough, who's based up in Durham University, about inner voices. Not my kind of inner voices are fine because I know they're me, but other people get very intrusive inner voices. And I talked to Nina Conti, the brilliant ventriloquist Nina Conti, and she has that. I used to think sometimes ventriloquists would be there and they'd look at their dummy and think, I wasn't expecting Charlie to say that. Who's really in control? I didn't think that was in my mind. Yeah, the classic kind of Michael Redgrave Dead of Night moment. And when I found out, Nina went, it's not really like that at all. She said the rest of her life is her going, why are you saying that? Oh, that was a boring thing to say. And then she puts on her puppet monkey and she goes, now I can talk. And that's where, in many ways, the real voice comes out. And that to me is, and so with it, sorry, very quickly on Charles Fernyhough, what he's done for people who've got those really intrusive thoughts that are beginning to make their life very difficult is they do a thing called avatar therapy, which is creating a face for the voice that is making your life difficult. So these, lots of different things that I looked at, but I'll just, because we haven't got long, the first thing I started with, and I talk quite a lot about death as well, because I think that's another thing which you can do with stand-up, is that you can, it's such a, George Carlin, the great American stand-up, said stand-up is a low art, but it's a very potent art. And I think, when I was writing this book was also around the time that my mum died, and of course when I was doing stand-up I had to put in some, I couldn't not write about that, though I decided I wanted to write lots of stupid stories about it rather than po-faced award-winning stories, because I kind of wanted to make sure that, to me, death is one of those things that certainly in the UK we're not necessarily great at handling, and we're so fearful of shame. I mean, I think that's another thing I realised more and more in the book, is this perpetual fear of shame that stops us doing so much. And, with death, when you lose someone that you love, you're dealing with all that grieving, but also there's another voice sometimes that comes in and goes, am I grieving correctly? Is this the wrong way to grieve? Are people looking at me going, he's not very good at grieving, is he? I'm going to tweet about how bad his grieving is. There's so many different things that are going on. So there's a lot of people I spoke to who had, my friend Rebecca Payton, who I won't have time to talk about deeply, but I will just say, if you get a chance, look up Rebecca's work, she wrote an amazing play, monologue called Sometimes I Laugh Like My Sister, which is about the death of her sister who was murdered in Mogadishu, and it's an amazing piece of work. But I'll just read one bit, sorry. My brain has never been working so fast at this time to go, no, you've got 3 minutes left, go for it. So This is, why do we become who we become? Now, doing science programs, again, this is what I tried to do in the book as well. I was talking to comedians and therapists. I talked to neuroscientists and geneticists, and I tried to make it as broad as possible. And one of the things that I find beautiful about genetics now and our general increasing understanding of the human mind and why we are as who we are is it's a lot messier than we'd thought. You know, there was a point where we're a blank slate. No, there's a gene that makes you do this. And now we've reached this kind of, with there's genes and there's culture and there's society, and it's all a kind of, you know, there's a mess. And we are many different potentials. There's, you know, because you have a gene for something doesn't mean that's your destiny. Because an event has happened in your life equally doesn't mean that has to mean that is your destiny. So I started off by writing about the myths of comedians, about why they become comedians. And some classic examples would be things like you know, the loss of a parent. So Eddie Izzard, when he was 7 years old, his mother died. And Eddie, again, over time, in the last few years, I think has talked more and more about that, about the fact that he believes why he became a comedian is because in his early life he had all of this love that came towards him. And then suddenly one day that love stopped. And now he feels that when he goes on at the O2 or Wembley Arena, for that period of time, for that 2 hours, there's this love. Other examples would be, you know, people like Barry Cryer. Barry Cryer never knew his father. Eric Idle. I won't tell you. Actually, I won't tell you that story because I don't think I'll do it justice. But it's that is an even more kind of grotesque loss that he suffered. Also, things like being the youngest. Kurt Vonnegut often talked about the fact that he believed that being the youngest often led to being the biggest show-off. And I am the youngest in my family, and I'm also the only boy. That meant I spent my whole childhood being best. And there's a lot of different things. So I started to think about, was there anything in my life that could be seen in terms of, if I was the BBC4 documentary maker, what would I nail my creation myth to? So I'll just read this. Do I have a traumatic event filed in my memory card box? Well, maybe. But even now, I wonder if it was traumatic enough to count as trauma, and I feel a certain embarrassment at bringing it up at all. It was late winter and dark. My sister had been riding a pony with her friend, and she and I were both in the back seat of the car, with my mum driving the short distance to our home. I was searching for my machine gun. It was my favourite toy, and it was under the passenger seat. It had a handle on the side, and it made a rat-a-tat-tat sound when you turned it. So I don't remember the moment of collision, but I presume there was a thud and a jolt, and everything stopped and was quiet, and then the sobbing started. Not me. I was 2 years old, though in my mind I was really a grown-up 3-year-old, as my birthday was only around the corner and there was going to be a party and Mum had planned a big cake. It was my sister who was sobbing. Her head had struck the right side passenger window and was bleeding. Another car had been on the wrong side of the road, hurrying to get home. His impatience changed everything. Mum was motionless in the driving seat, head up, eyes shut. I can still see it all clearly, though I'm aware my memory may have changed the details with each revisit. The stillness of her face is consistent. And I remember saying, why is Mummy's eyes closed? My sister didn't say anything. But what I recall most viscerally is the knowledge that it was all my fault. This had happened because I was looking for my toy machine gun. Somehow that had caused the crash. If I hadn't been squatting behind the passenger seat looking for that gun, I knew people would be very cross with me. I felt sick. I waited to be told off. But it never happened. I didn't see my mother for some time. She was still in a coma on my birthday, but we had a party anyway, and the cake was bought from a shop. During this period, an older woman in tweed was employed to look after us, but she was no Disney Mary Poppins, and she forced me to sit on a potty even though I had a painful boil on my bottom, and I cried and I cried and I cried, and my sisters rebelled as they would again and again and again, and fought against the beastliness that was being inflicted on their little brother. Then they ran away in protest with their anoraks full of biscuits. After the protest, a kinder woman in tweed replaced the anti-Poppins, and Mum eventually came home. Her jaw was held together by screws, and she didn't know who that boy or his sisters were, because she'd woken up in a time before any of us existed. I have very few memories of those days when she first left hospital, and perhaps that's just as well. The cover-up of the situation was done very proficiently by the grown-ups. Eventually, Mum's memory caught up with reality, and then life went on, though not in the same way it would have done if someone hadn't been on the wrong side of the road at the wrong speed. Not a bad life, just a changed future. That's my creation myth. And it's been very weird. First of all, when I wrote it, I really did think, is that enough? Is that enough of a... And now, of course, speaking to more and more people, the idea of being a 3-year-old who thought you'd caused a massive accident, that then your mum's in a coma, and then all the ramifications from the damage from that accident for the rest of our lives, it now feels ridiculous not to have, but equally my family, of course, we did like most people do. We just kept moving on. And as a comedian, you know this, but you know, you go on stage and you can talk about the weirdest things, right, to maybe 5,000 people, and then suddenly you go, oh God, I didn't know my dad was in, I'm dropping that routine. So we can share it all with strangers, and of course, there was no way round not giving the book to my sisters and to my dad, and I think one of the things that I found quite hard was when my dad started reading the book. And one of the things he said one day, he said, I wish you told me. I wish I'd known that you thought it was your fault, because then I could have done something about it. But of course, the thing is, he couldn't really, because I was 3, and that's another thing. Anyway, I better stop now. But it's my friend Philippa Perry, who's a brilliant therapist and a very lovely human being. We talked about the first conversation we ever had was about children and their brains, and the fact that one thing that always really sticks in my craw is when I see an adult shouting at a child as if they have an adult brain. I don't just mean like for parents here, that moment where you lose your temper and then you feel bad. I mean that bit where you think, stop now, stop. And you just have those moments where there's a 3-year-old and the adult's going, why have you done that? Why? Come on, why? I can't believe there's yogurt everywhere. You know, as if they're going to have a logical answer, as if the child, why have you put yogurt on the window? It's the medium I'm working in, you know, and that again, that understanding, and Philippa does a lovely thing. She told me when she sees that as a therapist, she can't hold back. If she's on a bus or a train, she has to walk up to that person, and she says, you know, she'll walk and say, I'm really sorry for interrupting. Are you having a bad day? I'm really sorry. And she said, more often than not, the parent will start shouting at her, but then that means the child knows that it's not just them. And I think, you know, these things, we're learning so much. Anyway, I better stop now. Thanks very much. Philippa, you're going to come back. Pippa! Why am I saying Philippa? Because I've just said Philippa, yeah.
I am, of course, a Philippa, actually.
Yes.
But Pippa is Philippa means I'm in trouble, actually. Philippa means my mother is cross.
My sister has the same. She was Camilla Jane, so Janie when fun. Camilla when put that down now.
Yes, yeah. True. That might be the first time I've ever heard Philippa in a friendly tone. I really enjoyed your book, and I love the way you've made these connections between being a comedian, and at the moment I feel stuck myself in a duality. Should I speak to you as a human or as a comedian? And that's what I wondered about the book, actually, was how did this, is it a chicken and egg situation? Was it a book that you wanted to write about how comedians become comedians? Or was it already a book about humans and what they can learn from comedians?
Well, initially it was, because I did a documentary after Robin Williams died, because I was so annoyed at this, what I thought telling mental health, and the whole thing just so trite. So I made the thing for Radio 4, and then I started writing a book that was going to be looking at comedians and mental health, and then seeing how much that can illuminate. And then it was when I was reading a brilliant book by Sarah Bakewell called At the Existentialist Cafe. And she's an author that I love, and I thought actually the more interesting book is trying to see how much, you know, the whole of humanity, because I find a lot, I'm sure you've had this at gigs, more and more, I don't know why, but in the last 10 years in particular, the different kind of shows I've done, the more likely that someone will come up to me in a bar afterwards and they want to say something. There's something that might have been ignited, or there's some connection that might have been made. And it made me realize, you know, how many people are going through existence in, you know, I often think those people who have to are always scared of saying the wrong thing, so don't say anything at all, or are always playing the part, whereas we have that. I mean, I think one of the big changes we've seen in stand-up amongst, in certain groups of stand-up, obviously it's a very broad genre, but, you know, people like Hannah Gadsby and Richard Gadd are people who go on stage, and in the old days, in the, you know, post-war comedy, a lot of it was people putting on a mask, you know, hiding their secret, hiding their sexuality, whatever it might be. And now with something like Hannah Gadsby's Nanette, that's this moment of tremendous, you know, for an hour and 15 minutes, this incredible revelation, this bit which is, this is my real life, as opposed to this is my comedy life.
I mean, I don't know how many people here are familiar with Nanette by Hannah Gadsby. If you haven't seen it, it is on Netflix, and I really recommend watching it. But it really is a sort of almost a revolution to stop stand-up comedy in a way, because watching that show, the revelations that she gives, I don't know how much I can say, will it ruin the show, that by telling a joke, we're stopping ourselves from being able to move on, essentially. So by telling jokes, we laugh at ourselves to protect ourselves, but perhaps then we don't deal with what we do. So then is comedy in some ways glamorizing suffering.
Well, I think she's proved that she's wrong in some ways in her thesis.
Okay.
Because it has made so many connections for so many people, and it has been so useful. So I don't think it's... we had a brief chat about it, actually. I chatted with her a while ago when I saw the show in Edinburgh. And I think she's talking about a kind of comedy, but not all stand-up comedy. Because Philippa Perry, again, the first time that I had a conversation with her, she talked about the fact that if you're making a joke about something, you haven't come to terms with it. That's not... And then another therapist called Josh Cohen doesn't agree with that at all. But then Philippa actually changed that, and she broadened it. She said, no, it's not that if you're making a joke, but it's about whether your joke also accepts the situation. So I talked about a very marginal, it's not even really a joke, but the first gig I did after my mum died, it was a club that I played very regularly, so I thought I can't ignore what's just happened in the last month. And as I got to the microphone, I had, the minor gag that I had is I said, thanks very much, it's lovely to see you all again. I haven't been here for a while because, my mum's just died, which has kind of got pros and cons. I mean, most of them are cons. But on the plus side, I can have my hair cut anywhere I want now. And just this thing of being able, that bit, I was thinking of all those people that I know who are in their 60s who kind of go, oh, God, my mum's coming, she doesn't know I smoke. All of these little connections. And I mentioned that to Philippa, and she said, but anything like that is fine because it acknowledges the situation. So I think there is a way. It's like when people talk about the fact that comedy, there always has to be a victim in the joke. And I don't think that's true either. I've seen lots of shows which are celebratory and filled with love and joy and still extremely funny, and they don't have to attack and they don't have to, punch down all the time.
Do you think that's because that's the easiest way to make a joke is the punching down? So that's the first thing we go to. And perhaps that's the first thing when we're learning comedy, we see maybe? Because I think there's such a difference between club comedy and the broad world of comedy, but most of us start to learn our trade in the club world, where your job in many ways is to try and control a room of very drunk people. And that can be, so your first training is in fact maybe not to entertain, but to sedate. And
also we're in a greater level of panic.
Yes.
So in a level of panic, you lash out, you look at the front row, and you go, look at his face, look at that jumper, and then actually that's all. So, and I'm always fascinated, because I think with some of the club comedy, it didn't need to go that low. And I've done it, and I imagine you've done it as well, that bit where afterwards you actually realise you don't have to keep punching at them.
No.
You can sometimes they've got more patience than you imagine, and they're interested. And you can woo them in, but because so many people have got that worst gig in their head is their starting point, they lash out, and then it goes downhill. Because I love the fact that quite often at my gigs, people will bring, either parents will bring their kids or kids will bring their parents. There's lots of different, and sometimes I'll get an old bloke coming up to me and going, I've got to admit, I didn't understand a word of that, but I had a lovely evening. So, that's the kind of, and I think people are far more sophisticated than a lot of programmers and commissioning editors believe they are. I think, I love that thinking of another Perry, thinking of Grayson Perry. When you watched his documentary about class, and he did one in Sunderland, I don't know if anyone saw this, but if you watched him talking to people on Sunderland, I think it was a Friday or a Saturday night out, they would start off the first question playing the part that they thought television would want. And then they would see that Grayson Perry had total respect for them and did not talk down to them and did not talk how, now this is how one should talk to someone who's from Sunderland.
Yes.
He talked to them as human beings, and then you just suddenly saw this change, this elevation of vocabulary, I can reveal who and I thought that says a great deal as well.
And that's interesting, the idea of revealing your true self. And you talk in your book about personas and how when we start in comedy, we start with a persona. I wonder, when do you think that first comes in human life? And I'm thinking of, so not as a performer, but our performance, like the first day we go to a new school and perhaps we play the part that we think will be the most accepted.
There is certainly a point. I think I started to notice it with my son, even around kind of 4 or 5 years old. I think it's the first time that you start to get that worry that your child is becoming conscious of other people's judgment of them. And then, of course, that increases and increases. I find it, because I think back and I think of the number of times, that it's an interesting thing with social media does this. I don't know if you found this. There's people who are kind of your friends, maybe not very close friends, but for people you've drunk with in the pub, and you thought you knew their values and what they believed in, and then you see their social media profile and you see what they tweet, and you go, whoa, oh, you're playing the part, because when they're with you, they think, oh, Pippa's this kind of person, so, oh, yeah, this is what I want to talk about. I love musical theatre, and very compassionate, and whatever it might be, and, so, with me, oh, we might better talk about Boris Karloff, Robin's here. But it's, but that, and then you find out who has a through line where what they represent when you're with them is actually quite close to their reality. And I think that's true in comedy as well. There's some comedians that people watch on stage go, isn't he great? What a lovable person. Wouldn't you love to have a drink with them? And you have to keep quiet when someone goes, do you know? And you go, yes, they're lovely.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting, I mean, in my stand-up and in people like my friend Josie Long and other, I think, we do, the hard thing sometimes is when you're not playing much more than the persona you adopt the whole time. Because if someone comes up to you and says, I hated your gig, they didn't really hate the jokes, they hate you. Because whereas other people, it is all just kind of, it's jokes. So, the Jimmy Carr kind of method.
So do you feel that your on-stage persona is really close to your actual persona?
I think it represents things that I really believe, and I think it is. I think it's a heightened version. It's the adrenaline-fueled version, and it remains for about an hour and a half after a gig, and then I go back to the Holiday Inn, and that's every. But I hope it is. I believe it is, and I think that Can I tell the story about Barry Crimmins? Sorry, I dedicate the book to Barry Crimmins, who was a wonderful and brilliant American comedian, never hugely renowned, but very important, big influence on people like Bill Hicks. And there's a film about him called Call Me Lucky, which I highly recommend you watch. And he told me this story. We were talking about ethics and what you're prepared to say on stage. And I think that's a very important, for me, it is an important thing. That if I come up with a joke, which I think, how can that be, I think some people might see it like that, and I wouldn't want to upset, but I do think about the upset of people, and I do think about how comfortable I would be arguing for that. And Barry told this story about, he was playing a gig, and the couple in the front row just laughing and laughing. Huge laughs. He was the final act on. There'd been 2 other acts before him. And when he came off, he's drinking the bar, and they come up and they go, well, we had such a great time. It was, we loved watching you, Barry. It was so good. Oh, yeah. And he went, thanks very much. It was lovely to see all that laughter from you. And they went, yeah, we had a great night. It had been difficult, but because we don't come out very much. He said, what do you mean you don't come out very much? He said, yeah, about once a year. And he said, do you come out once a year? And yeah, just once, sometimes twice. But we've got a child who's quite severely disabled, and there's only one person we can get to really properly deal with all of our child's needs. And we have to admit, we found it difficult because the first 2 acts just kept saying, retard this and retard that, and just throwing that word around. And we couldn't ever really relax. And then you came on, and we get a sense of your humanity. And he said afterwards, that to me is a very important thing. He said, you have to remember that words are shrapnel. And when you throw them around, sometimes you've got to consider how they might be received. And I think that is, that's part of, I think, that thing as well, which is what I hope I am on stage, is what I can be off stage as well. It's probably the better version, because, I spend 2 hours a night going, look at me, aren't I great? And then I'm the normal twit for the rest of the time. So probably there's still a level of, it's the better version of me than reality.
So I'm really interested in the idea of words as shrapnel, because at the moment, we are going through this social media revolution, and we often hear thrown around phrases like, it's just my opinion, I can say what I like, it's just, you deal with it, I am who I am. So what part of of comedy what can we learn as in our normal day-to-day lives can we learn about from that? What can we learn about how powerful words are?
Well, I think there's a lot of supposed free speech wars going on now, and I'm not actually sure how real they are. There are certain things, but I think it's been hugely, I see quite a few people who are these kind of right-wing free speech warriors, but you actually check the war they're prepared to fight, and it turns out it's for very specific bits of speech. Whereas for something like the ACLU in America, sometimes they are having to defend members of the Ku Klux Klan, because that's actually, but I think, but I think it's a really important thing that the power of speech is a thing which, to have the level that we have as a species, is remarkable. And the complexity of that means of the way it can be interpreted. Like, I think social media, one of the big problems is, I think a lot of debate has become the same as the debate that happens on Twitter. And I wish more people would realise that Twitter is not a debating place, because you have 280 characters and all you can do is go, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. And that's all that happens. And then we've seen so many debates now that are defined in that level of aggression. And I think we're losing sometimes the complexity. And also realising that when you see something on Twitter, it's the different ways of interpreting one sentence are remarkable, and we have to take that into account. That's why I love stand-up, is you're in the room and you know what's going on, and you are able to try and make your point clearer. Just a cold sentence can be taken in so many ways. But I do think it's a really important thing. We have, free speech is a great thing to have, but it doesn't mean you have to say every single thing that's in your head. It means you can go, oh, do you know what? This is what I want to say. I want to use my... It's like swearing and all of those things. When you see swearing done... there's a way where you just go, that's too much swearing. And there's a way you go, whoa, we waited that long, but man, that was a good... all of those. Yeah. And I think the same with free speech, which is, if you can say anything, think about, what you really want to say and why you want to say it and why you believe what you believe.
Do you think, I was just, what just popped in my head then was thinking about sort of the death of the essay, so people are not reading long pieces anymore, they want Twitter-sized pieces, in the same way that jokes are starting to, we're starting to get these sort of memes of jokes or 1-minute clips of people's routines taken out of 20 or an hour. So do you fear for the death of the hour-long show?
No, I think there'll always be... I mean, you're right, the context is such an important thing, and so many of the things we see, the angry things that are drummed up in the mass media are where a joke has been taken out of context. But I've just been rereading the brilliant book by Neil Postman, what's it called? Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he, in 1985, was talking about the lowering of the variety of words in speeches by presidents, and he was talking about a lot of the things we're seeing now. But I think there are enough people who are always going to remain... I mean, when I do Infinite Monkey Cage and when we do big tours, and I see 8-year-olds in the audience and I see 90-year-olds in the audience, and I see the questions that they give, and I see, there's 10,000 people sometimes come to see Brian, and then unfortunately they have to deal with me suddenly. But unfortunately, I've worked away going, they don't understand what he's saying anymore, I better come on and do a Brian Blessed impersonation. So, but it's... I think there's still enough people out there, but I think it's also important that a lot of the people in charge of media don't keep being one step behind. I think I remember having a meeting years ago with the BBC channel, and they were saying, oh, well, our audience won't get this, our audience won't understand that. It was a teenage kind of, that was their main... I said, I've just played the Reading Festival to a bunch of drunk 16 to 18-year-olds, 3,000 in a tent, and they are able to take on a lot more than you imagine. And I think that bit of when you go and see a film, or you see an exhibition, or you listen to a piece of music that the first time you didn't really get. I mean, that's another thing that we have to fight for, because the songs now have to be written in a way that go, I want to download that now, not the kind of old Bowie thing and various others where you go, oh, I'm not sure if this is as good as the previous one. Let me listen again and again and again, and then the shamanism and the mesmerism has occurred. So I think we have to put that effort in as well, the effort to look longer, to listen harder, to be prepared to go, I'm not really sure that I'm enjoying this. Oh, hang on a minute, that has really, that's there now, and it can't be taken away.
And I suppose that also comes back to, the Twitter aggression often comes from instant response rather than reading something, feeling the feeling, I don't like that, why don't I like it? I'm going to take a moment to process that rather than immediately fire back, I hate you and your mum. I wondered as well, Robin, you talk in the book quite a lot about your anxiety, and actually anxiety is something that's quite prevalent in comedy land. I myself have also suffered from anxiety. And you talk about actually how it's been very useful to you in many ways, so it's a gift and a curse, because it means that you're hyper-aware of everything. Do you feel like, therefore, you can only be a comedian if you have anxiety?
No, I think there's the old line that Richard Feynman, the physicist, when he was once talking about scientific knowledge with a Buddhist monk, and the Buddhist monk said the keys to heaven also open the gates to hell. So I think finding that balance, I know a lot of comedians who seem to be absolutely fine, and I know a lot as well who are, filled with anxiety, but also I've realised how much, I've talked to quite a few therapists since I've written the book, and like going around university campuses and finding out how the age of anxiety, the actual, and depression and other forms of melancholy is going down and down and down. We're being observed by so many people, or at least we feel we are. But I think all of these things, it's finding a way of taking something which may well be a disadvantage and turning it into something that's useful. And I think a lot of what we need to try and do as human beings is find a way of taking the troublesome thing and creating it into a shape and a form, so you can look at it. And like the avatar therapy for inner voices, for instance, is you've given something shape and form, and then you can properly stare at it and go, right, what am I doing? I mean, I only realised in writing this book that lots of different things that I just thought were general traits that I had were just all lumped under basically anxiety. And that's what they were. And also about the hypervigilance, which hypervigilance is basically where in almost any situation where there's more than me, I will be thinking about what the other person might be thinking on a train carriage. Is that person looking at me, what they're thinking? Oh, I've just eaten a piece of beetroot. Are they thinking, why is that stupid old man eating some beetroot? What's going on? Blah, 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 blah. So it's that bit. And it is very tiring eventually. And I hadn't realised quite how tiring it was. But then I can turn it into the useful thing, which is it shows. But I don't think it's as if I'll ever be able to get rid of that. But at least I now know what it is. And I know where it kind of probably comes from.
Yes, I love that idea, yeah, the physicalisation of something so that we can actually see what it is rather than just be haunted by it. Thank you. Let's open up for any questions. Does anyone have a question? If you have a question, raise your hand and we will come to you. Any questions for Robin? Oh, one down here. We just wait for the microphone, is that okay?
Oh, Netflix. Oh, the microphone.
So
yes.
that people online can hear you.
It's very simple. When are you doing your Netflix special?
Well, I wonder if my stuff's too niche. It's that weird thing. I mean, I'd love to do... I mean, what I love... I have to admit, what I love about stand-up is doing it in the room. Because I do think that there's probably comics you've seen. I mean, there's some brilliant filming of specials now as well. I have to admit, there's some stuff that I've seen that I think, you know, Stuart Lee's stuff has been done brilliantly in the past. And I would kind of like to, I mean, I'd like to do something actually based around this book because I found it very interesting travelling around and talk every single afternoon or night afterwards. I've had a conversation with someone who has been willing to, and it's a weird thing because I come from a long line of priests. But unfortunately, my lack of belief in God does get in the way of that, even in the Anglican Church, which was a surprise. But you end up almost feeling, I don't know if you ever had that, where sometimes you think, am I in the pulpit really? Because sometimes people want to share afterwards in that. I think it's an interesting way now, the different ways we've found of finding people to communicate with, where you want to sometimes tell a secret. I had one series of shows where I didn't even talk that much. In fact, eventually there was no death in it at all, but it was the tour that started with me having two different stories about when my mum died. But for some reason there must have been something in there still, because people would come up to me, and an old man came up to me and went, "Hello, my son told me to come down to this show, and I just want to tell you I'm having a lovely evening, because I've had quite a bad year. My wife died and I found it quite difficult. And anyway, thank you very much." And just the fact they wanted to, and it was a stranger. And then the bloke behind, it was a ridiculous thing. He went, "Oh, Robin, I've come to loads of your shows. Oh, I've had a weird one as well. Just found out my sister died yesterday. Anyway," and, you know, and my favourite one was I had one man who came up to me. I was on the stage before the gig because I quite like to not, you know, have too much of the kind of, you know, now the show starts, now it ends. And this guy said, "Hello, Robin. I've seen you quite a few times in Nottingham. I wasn't going to come today because it was my mum's funeral. But then I thought, I fancy a laugh, so no pressure." And you know, but I do, you know, that other bit of communication, I think, is a lot of fun, you know, and it's also because it's not a selfless act, is it? Because we're all seeking purpose, and if someone can get something from a show you're doing that is more than just life, if they've found something in that, you know, you go, "Oh, that was great. I was useful." You know,
which is funny because that comes back to your duality, doesn't it? Of the fact that should I be here? Do I deserve to be in front of these people? Have I earned this? And is my pain good enough to share it or whatever? I did a show called "There Are No Guilty Pleasures." At the end, I invited everyone to stand up and say what they loved that they were ashamed of. And someone stood up and said, "I love watching those videos on YouTube of people pushing their spots." And everyone went, and there was a pause. And then someone else stood up and said, "So do I!" And we hugged. And in that moment, I felt, I have done someone a service today.
Oh, that's kind of Spartacus meets Adrian Mole.
Yeah.
That's an absolutely lovely thing.
Any other questions for Robin? One at the back there. If you could wait for the microphone, that'd be great.
Hi, you might not like me for this question, but here it is. So what does make us human?
I think so much of it is about, one, being a social animal, and two, being persistently aware of others' judgment on different levels, not to a hypervigilant, but I think that we become who we become so much on on other people's gaze, other people's looks, other people, of how we are wondering other people are thinking about us. And sometimes we don't even, someone the other day said to me, "You're talking rubbish, we're all individuals." And I was like, no, we're not. We are, and we can be, though equally that can be a bad way to go. But to be aware of fitting in, I think, is one of the major, self-consciousness is where so many of our problems come from and so many of our joys come from as well. So much of our sorry, go on, yes.
Do you think that is a national issue? Do you think that's to do with race and place, or do you think that's about being?
I think it can be different in different societies. I think in other societies, I think with a lower amount of supposed individualism, that I think is perhaps maybe one of the issues, and I'm thinking just on my feet here, but I wonder if that is one of the issues in a society like ours, which is we are both meant to be individuals, but we're also fighting that directly against the fact that we're terrified of other people's judgment as well. So one moment we're standing there as I am alone, and yet all the time you're thinking, I wonder how people are judging me as I stand here saying that I am alone. So I think that may well come into it. And also we have so many false divides. I mean, this is one of the problems, like something like race, you know, which is a fiction, you know, and there are so many different, I mean, we've both done things involving religion and stuff like that, and the older I've got, the more I think I'm fascinated when I see people think that just because you have religion, you must believe in all of these particular things, whatever your religion is. And there's so many false divides that we don't go beyond to actually see the human being. And I think that's one of the problems, because I always go back to Kurt Vonnegut, because I love Kurt Vonnegut. I know he was, you know, not always a great human being, but what he wrote was very often wonderful. And there was a human being who had seen the worst of humanity, and also was still struggling to find out where the best of humanity might be. And just that simple thing that he says in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, when he's asked to give advice to all the babies of the world, and he just says, my one bit of advice is, God damn it, you've got to be kind. And I think that's the starting point. Also, this is on a different thing, but it's still about that. One of my main ways of judging people is by seeing how they treat the person with the lowest amount of power in the room with the person with the highest amount of power. And of course, in the world of the media, we see that a lot. And when I see people who are viciously aggressive to the runner or the production assistant and then ever so fawning with the executive producer, I immediately go, you will not be someone I am lured towards, you know. So I think, you know, that bit where authenticity, I think, is the struggle we have as human beings, which is how true am I to myself with this group of people? How different am I? I hope that's in...
Should we go to this question here, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, we seem to be living in a bit of a golden age where now you can consume comedy in more places than ever, you know, through podcasts, TV shows, etc. Do you think that's driven by the fact that there's simply more talent and more opportunity, or we as humans right now have more need of laughing at ourselves and releasing and dealing with anxiety?
I think it may well actually merely be a more capitalist thing, which is that it's quite cheap to make. And so I think that does come into it. And I think we've found that in all different forms now. The access to art and creativity is, again, the keys to heaven, the gates to hell. It's both fantastic and wonderful, but there's so much of it that it can almost be oppressive. I would highly recommend, by the way, just thinking of how much access there is, because people are able to make things for I mean, I'll give you an example, actually, just of things that I want to recommend. Griefcast. Have you done Griefcast?
No, I've not had a significant death. I'm waiting for one.
Oh, that terrible moment, isn't it, going, I still can't be on. Come on, someone go. Griefcast is one of those great examples of what can be done with the way things can be made so cheaply by someone called Carrie Lloyd, and each week someone different talks about grief, and it's a fantastic piece of communication. So I think it is brilliant that there are these available things. I think the problem is that there are things that can be boosted much higher because they're controlled by bigger interests, and therefore we may well miss a lot of the kind of joy and delights that are out there. But I was just going to quickly mention something. I saw a film yesterday that was made for £3,000, and it's called Super November, and it's by my friend Josie Long and her friend, the director, Doug King, and it was amazing. I watched it, and it's not just it's made by a friend of mine. I watched it and I went, wow, you can do that for £3,000. So I also think what is great is not so much that we can access so much art and creativity, it's also that anyone here, has the ability to make something. And then, of course, the hard bit is to make sure that other people can see it as well.
Do you think, sorry, just before we just move on to your question, just to continue to answer this question, do you think it's also because suddenly we're getting stories that we weren't able to hear before? So suddenly we're actually able to hear the kind of comedy that maybe chimes with us better than maybe we didn't all want the Generation Game, but it was on. You know, I love the Generation Game, it's not a slur against the Generation Game. But now you can find the comedy done by the voice that speaks to you maybe more sincerely. I don't know.
I think that is a useful thing. I mean, sometimes people do talk about a golden age, and you do, if you pick up an old copy of the Radio Times from 1975, you go, oh, actually, it wasn't all Arena and Horizon and Kenneth Clark wandering around and going, this thing's very old and beautiful. A lot of it was really, you know, there's that. Yeah. So I do think, I think there's so much. I think that's the only, there's the great term cosmological vertigo, which was something Paul Gauguin apparently had, which was all of this information, at that point scientific information, about things like the tree of life from Charles Darwin and the beginnings of our understanding or not understanding of quantum mechanics, and it becomes daunting. So I think that's the other thing, is to, we have to be careful about how we curate. You have to put a lot of effort in. It's very easy to spend the whole evening. What did you watch last night? I watched 200 channels that I flicked past going, nope, 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 nope. Oh, it's midnight, good night. You know, so that's...
Yeah, yeah. A bit like the Edinburgh Festival, where anyone is allowed at the Edinburgh Festival to put on a show, which means that often you go, should we just stay and watch telly?
Yeah.
Great, your question, please.
I love the idea that there's a lot of comradeship amongst comedians. I hope that's true. Do you critique each other, and is it helpful for you, for other people to give you advice, or do you really not want to hear it? And the other thing is, where do you get your other inspiration from? Because it seems you're so very busy with seeing your Freudian psychiatrists and going to other people's shows. So you must get your ideas from real life somewhere. Where do you have the time?
Well, I spend my whole life travelling around. So, I mean, this is literally, I think, now the 74th, if you want to call it a gig, in a row without a day off. So I'm on trains the whole time. I'm walking through towns and countryside the whole time. I'm reading books all the time. I'm sitting in places, in cafes on my own, eavesdropping and hearing what's going on. So I've got a lot of... It's only an hour a week, by the way, with the Freudian. I'm not overdoing it. But it is... So that's where... And I'm lucky because I'm very broadly shallow, basically. I have no deep understanding of anything. But I'm in a situation where, because I do science programs, I get scientists coming up to me and saying, oh, we're doing some experiments. Would you like to be involved? And I go, yeah, that sounds good. So I get to do events with a very broad number of people as well. You know, I've done stuff at the RI Lecture Theatre, and, you know, I've had a magnetic pulse to the left-hand side of my brain in the motor region, which stopped me being able to talk. It can happen. And I've, you know, dipped my finger in liquid nitrogen and had fMRIs and done all of these, you know, so I'm quite manic, really, in terms of, once I wake up in the morning, I think, right, what do I want to do today, and what do I want to achieve, and how much do I need to write, and how much do I need to experience? Right, I'm going to go there, 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 and there. And sometimes it's exhausting, but I don't think there's an alternative. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I do think, because there's this kind... I don't think it is true that comedians are really bitchy. I actually think we might be the most honest group of artists, and I'm sure there's other people in our... But because we end up saying things to each other, and because a lot of it is... I mean, most of the... I know it's lots of different groups, but I have very close friends who are comics who we share very strange stories with. And I'm very happy when... and I think most of us quite like it when someone goes, oh, I've got an idea for you. In fact, you know the... what's it called? Old Rope. Old Rope, which is a new material night on a Monday in just off Oxford Street. And it's a lovely thing. You go out there and you do 10, 15 minutes new material, and then you walk off and someone comes up to you and goes, oh, you know that bit? I've just thought of another bit you could do with that. So there's a lot of that. I mean, there are also, of course, the bitchy people and the people who... I mean, the dangerous thing, and which I think I learnt, was you've got to make sure you don't look at where other people are. If you spend your whole life being angry that Michael McIntyre's just sold out the O2 for 30 nights, you are not going to create anything. There's no interesting anger from someone who does a half-an-hour routine about why they're cross that Michael, you know, so I think that bit. And people get overly hung up as well on going, well, I don't think that's funny at all. That's what's beautiful about comedy. You know, so I've seen people say, Mrs. Brown's Boys is not funny. You go, well, There's 10 Nights at the Hammersmith Apollo where people were laughing, so you might not find it funny. Well, Stuart Lee, actually, who wrote the introduction to the book, is a great example. He's one of the... I mean, if you look under... Whenever there's an article in a newspaper online about a comedian, there's more there than about, you know, atrocities around the world. No, this person is not funny. Yes, they are. No, that, you know, that bit is a fascinating thing to see, you know, and to try not to get caught up in.
Any last
there's
questions?
one at the back
Was there one at
there.
the back? Yes, brilliant.
Hi. Has the book changed any of your family relationships?
It's interesting because I do think I hope, had a positive thing. I think by writing it, and I genuinely do find it there's a lot that I don't put in the book because I always think, again, about collateral damage and there's stories that are not just mine to tell, you know, and so I'm being very careful about that. But I think it has opened something up. And it's not that my family, ever closed things off, but we did that thing of just keeping moving on. And I'm the one who's always been the overly ruminating child. And eventually, you know, at the age of 49, writing this, one of my sisters, I have one sister who lives out in Australia, and she's been saying, she said, we've got to talk about this. We've got to talk about it while there's time. We need to talk more about these things. And I think that, you know, for me, it's something we talked about beforehand. I think it's a really useful thing as a human being not to be scared of examining why you are who you are, but I also think it's an important thing not to shackle yourself to that as well, to decide that this is the event in your life that means you are now what you are. You know, when I was mentioning before about genes and nature and nurture and all that, this is the fascinating thing. As human beings, we have so much potential. And we don't have to say, I can't do that. I mean, so much, again, I kind of talk about this in the book, but I've seen it from lots of different people's work, that fact that to give permission to someone, you know, from doing shows, I think sometimes people do feel they've got permission to come up to that performer and give a little bit of their story, or permission to be an artist. Permission, you know, as we're seeing now, it does feel like after a beautiful time of expansion post-war in terms of across, you know, class and gender, to some extent now we are seeing that close up again, and there's organisations like Arts Emergency which are about saying to people, you might feel you come from a background that says you can't be a poet or you can't be a sculptor. Yes, you can. Everyone can. Don't be scared of your creativity. I know this is a different thing I'm answering, but I think that person over there was going to ask that, and I have a gift. So overall, I don't feel there's been a negative. Though interesting, I'm doing a gig near my dad doing a talk about the book, and he's basically said, "Oh, I don't think you'll want me here." Yeah. So I think but we do talk about these things, and I hope. You know, it's a dangerous thing, though. I talk about things like suicidal thoughts in the book, you know, and these are things that I would never talk about, you know, around Christmas lunch.
Yeah.
And so you hand that over. Well, actually, there's probably been some Christmas lunches where it was very close to the forefront. But it's, yeah, so I hope that it's been written in a way that I think the way it's been received, but it was still terrifying to do, you know. I'm glad I did, though.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Sorry we didn't manage to get to all your questions. But Robin is going to stay around. He's going to be signing books outside, so do take a chance to say hello to him if you would like. And really all there is to say is thank you so much, Robin.
Thank you very much, Pippa. Thanks for doing that. I hope it was all right.